I was pleased with the way my scene looked in the director's class. It was cinematic, the actors were great, and I'd chosen appropriate music. The only problem was the dialogue could hardly be heard, which spoiled the whole thing. Of course, the sound was being recorded by a student who'd never done it before, and didn't have the proper equipment, so perhaps it was to be expected. Nonetheless, it was very disappointing. But the teacher, Jim Pasternak, was encouraging, and the other students liked what I'd done, so it wasn't a complete flop. We don't always have control over everything in life, and that's why we depend on the support of others. In particular, because a film director has to focus on so many different elements of putting a story together, he or she relies on a producer to hire a crew of people who are proficient in their area of expertise. Naturally, when students are involved in filmmaking, mistakes happen, but that's all part of the learning curve. Fortunately, I'd had the luxury of working on studio-funded feature films and only worked with professionals, so this was a whole new experience for me. I really enjoyed this new challenge, though. It was creatively stimulating and lots of fun. In addition, I'd been teaching a weekly acting class in Venice for a few months, and a couple of students from the directing class joined up. That was a good time. Nathan came to visit for 2 weeks from Las Vegas, and we took a trip to San Francisco and stayed at the Levinson house for a couple of nights. The family were there at the time, and Nathan was in awe of the huge house and grounds, as well as the private chef who made him whatever meal he wanted. He was in heaven. He also got along with Jack Levinson, who was the same age, about 14. Sam Levinson was a couple of years older, and although he was around and acknowledged Nathan, he pretty much kept to himself. Naturally, Nathan was overwhelmed with the amount of technical toys the boys had, but I think he had the most fun having a pillow fight with Jack. He really liked the Levinsons' 2 chocolate brown standard poodles, brother and sister Henry and Lily. I was very fond of the dogs too, and always made a fuss of them. They liked me too. I knew that the Levinsons had decided to move to Connecticut and were in the process of buying a house there. Well, make that a mansion. I got a call one day from Barry's business manager asking me if I'd be willing to stay at the Ross House in Marin County for a few weeks and take care of the dogs. Apparently, the house in Connecticut was being renovated, and they didn't feel it was safe for the dogs to be there. Also, since the Ross property was on the market, they wanted me to be available for the estate agents who were going to be showing it. The housekeeper, Vivienne, and the handyman/gardener, Ambrose, would be at the house for short periods during the day, but I'd be there on my own at night, with the dogs, of course, which I didn't mind one bit. Vivienne was a lovely woman in her late 30s, originally from South America, and always made sure I had enough food. During that time, we also had fun designing a calendar for the Levinsons with photos of Henry and Lily, who we dressed appropriately for every month of the year. They didn't seem to mind at all. Ambrose was probably in his 40s and a really nice man. We'd take the dogs for long walks together, and he'd tell me about his life in El Salvador before he moved to the States. Sometimes he'd bring his son to visit. The real estate agent brought a few people over to see the property, and generally I'd be outside sitting around the pool, out of the way, with Henry and Lily by my side. It was autumn, so even though the weather wasn't too cold, it certainly wasn't suitable for sunbathing in a bikini. One day the agent announced that someone very special and important was coming to see the house. So I took my place with the dogs and my book at the pool as usual, while the estate agent gave this special person a tour of the property. 10 minutes later, 2 figures emerged from the inside of the house through large ornate glass doors and descended the stone steps down towards the garden. I turned and saw the agent with the tennis player, Andre Agassi. As soon as Agassi saw the dogs, he headed towards the pool area. The agent was gesturing for Agassi to follow him in the other direction, but he was captivated by the sight of the dogs. "Hi! What beautiful dogs!" he said, as he made his way down to the pool. Henry and Lily immediately responded to the warmth of his voice and went over to him. "My wife and I are thinking of getting dogs like this. They're great." I told him their names and said that they were brother and sister, and how sweet and intelligent they were. While Agassi spent time stroking and fussing the dogs, which they loved, the estate agent was standing waiting in the top garden, practically tapping his foot in annoyance and giving me dirty looks. It was obvious that Andre Agassi was more interested in the dogs than the house. And since there wasn't a tennis court on the property, I was surprised that he and Steffi Graf were even considering buying it. Eventually, Agassi pulled himself away from the dogs and joined the agent, but then soon left. The agent proceeded to chastise me and asked me to be sure and take the dogs for a walk next time someone came to look at the property. A few weeks later, I escorted Henry and Lily on the red-eye flight to New York, feeling it would be less traumatic for them to be on the plane at night, and hopefully they could sleep in the hold of the plane. I was certainly very comfortable in my first-class seat, one of the many perks of the Levinsons' accumulated air miles. We were met at JFK by Lydio, a good-looking guy in his 30s, who'd been hired as the Connecticut version of Ambrose as handyman/dog handler. Oh, he was a wonderful person whose equally great wife, Gina, had recently been hired to work as Diana Levinson's assistant in this palatial mansion set in the heart of the country on several acres of land. There were also 2 other houses on the estate, including a large, beautiful house where Diana's daughter Michelle and her husband-to-be lived, and where they would eventually raise 2 children. There was, of course, a swimming pool, as well as a lake with a boathouse. Ironically, at this property, there was a tennis court, although I never actually saw anyone playing the game. While I'd been dealing with my cancer experience for the past 3 years, Barry had been busy making films such as Bandits with Bruce Willis and Cate Blanchett, and An Everlasting Peace with Billy Connolly. Both films were comedies, and although the reviews had been pretty good, they weren't exactly box office hits. Barry was now in the process of editing Envy, another off-the-wall comedy starring Jack Black and Ben Stiller. The character Jack Black was playing becomes rich with a wacky invention that his friend and neighbour, the Ben Stiller character, refuses to get involved with. While the wealth of Jack Black's character increases and he continues to live next to his friend, envy ensues, resulting in all kinds of crazy mayhem. After I'd settled into the guest house across from the main house, Barry asked if I'd like to take a look at the film, which he was fine-tuning with his editor, Stu Linder. They'd set up an editing suite in a huge converted barn adjoining the stables, where a couple of horses were kept. The Levinsons later added a few llamas and several chickens. It was almost a farm. I thought Envy was funny and a very clever concept, albeit pretty wacky. You'll have to look it up if you really want to know the whole story. Unfortunately, the studio and distributors weren't so happy and called for several more edits, which Barry and Stu thought unnecessary. I did too. Anyway, the film was re-edited and then edited again. And when I went to the final screening a few weeks later in LA, it just didn't seem like the same film. It wasn't the least bit funny. This was definitely a case of too many cooks, resulting in another disappointing box office failure for Barry. Unfortunately, this is the nature of the beast, and all Barry could do was simply move on to another project. Next time, working on a new script with Barry for Robin Williams. Thanks for listening.